On the edge of a small, fog-draped village, there stood a crooked little cottage that everyone knew but nobody visited unless they had to. It belonged to a very small woman. She wasn't just short. Everything about her was small. Her hands were tiny, her boots were tiny, her spectacles were tiny, and even her name had shrunk over the years until people simply called her the Teeny Tiny Woman. The Teeny Tiny Woman lived alone. Her husband had died long ago. Her children had grown and gone far away, and the cottage had slowly filled with the quiet tick of the clock and the whisper of the wind through the cracks around the windows. She did not mind the quiet. In fact, she preferred it. It was easier to hear herself think, easier to listen for the kettle boiling, and easier to notice when the world outside changed in small, important ways. One late autumn afternoon, as the sky turned the color of cold iron and the wind brushed the trees bare, the teeny tiny woman pulled on her teeny tiny shawl and her teeny tiny boots and decided to go out. "There must be something I can use for supper," she murmured to herself. "A carrot, perhaps, or a potato, or even just a good bone for soup." Her cupboard was almost empty. The last carrots had gone soft and gray. The last onions had sprouted pale, accusing roots. The teeny tiny woman hated going to bed hungry, and she hated it even more when the cottage creaked with the ache of emptiness. So she locked her teeny tiny door, tucked the key into her pocket, and walked down the narrow lane. The village lay some distance away, across fields and along a road rutted with cart tracks. If she went there, she would have to spend what little money she had left. There was another way, shorter but far less pleasant, the path that went behind the church and through the old graveyard. The graveyard made most people uneasy, especially in autumn, when the mist clung to the headstones and the yew trees whispered in voices that sounded almost human. But the teeny tiny woman did not scare easily. She had lived a long time and knew that the dead kept to themselves so long as the living did the same. Besides, she told herself, stepping onto the narrow muddy path, there might be something useful there, something no one will miss. The church bell tolled 5 slow, echoing notes as she passed. Each toll rolled through the fog like a wave across a gray sea. The gate to the graveyard was iron and cold beneath her glove. She pushed it open, and it groaned in protest, as if it preferred to stay shut. "Don't fuss," she said softly. "I'll be quick." The graveyard beyond the gate was a tangle of leaning stones and moss-covered angels. Names had faded from some headstones altogether, the letters worn away by rain and time. Crows perched upon the larger monuments, watching with bright black eyes as she picked her careful way along the path. The ground was uneven, thick with fallen leaves that hid the hollows and roots beneath. The teeny tiny woman moved slowly, peering here and there. She wasn't exactly sure what she was looking for. A bit of fallen firewood from the old yews, perhaps, or something left behind after a funeral feast, though that was unlikely. Families usually took everything with them. Grief often made people cling tighter to what they had. She was almost at the far end of the graveyard, where the oldest stones tilted as if they were whispering secrets to each other, when she saw it. There, sticking up out of the damp earth beside a broken stone, was a bone. It was small and clean, as if it had been polished by the rain. The teeny tiny woman stared at it, then glanced around. No one was in sight. The graveyard was empty, except for the crows and their faint, rustling movements. "A good soup bone," she whispered, "just the right size." She hesitated. It felt wrong to take something from a grave, but her stomach twisted with hunger, and the wind cut through her shawl like a cold knife. The bone was small, barely more than a scrap. Surely, she told herself, no one would mind. Whoever lay beneath that stone had been gone a very long time. Their name had vanished from the stone. The living had forgotten them, and the dead, she reminded herself, did not need bones for supper. The teeny-tiny woman bent down and plucked the bone from the earth. It came free with a soft, sucking sound, like a foot stepping out of mud. For a moment she thought she heard something, a sigh perhaps, or a whisper curled inside the wind. But then a crow cried harshly overhead, and the sound was gone. "Nonsense," she said briskly, tucking the bone into her pocket. "Just the wind, just the leaves." She left the graveyard, the bone knocking lightly against the key in her pocket as she walked. The sky darkened from iron to ink. By the time she reached her crooked little cottage, the first stars were peeking out, weak and shivery in the cold. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. She lit a candle and hung her kettle over the small fire in the hearth. Water sloshed softly as she filled it. Then she took out the bone and held it up to the flickering light. It really was a good bone, smooth and white, with just enough weight that she could imagine the flavor melting into the water. "You'll do nicely," she said, and dropped it into the kettle. The water began to heat, trembling as if it were frightened. The teeny-tiny woman shook her head at herself. She was tired, that was all. Too many hours alone with nothing but the sound of her own thoughts had made her imagination a little too eager. She added a pinch of salt, the last scrap of a wilted herb, and half a dried onion. The smell drifted through the cottage, thin but comforting. By the time the soup was ready, night had settled fully over the village. The wind pressed its face against the windows, sighing and rattling like a beggar asking to be let in. The teeny-tiny woman set out her teeny-tiny bowl and her teeny-tiny spoon and ladled out a portion of broth. It wasn't much, but it was warm. She blew on it lightly, watching the steam curl and twist. Just as she lifted the spoon to her lips, she heard it. At first, it was only a murmur, a scrap of sound tangled up with the wind and the creaking of the house. She frowned and lowered her spoon. The cottage fell quiet, except for the soft bubbling of the kettle. Then, clear and thin as a thread stretched tight, a voice whispered, "Any woman, give me back my one." The spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered against the bowl. She went still, every muscle locked. "That," she said, and her own voice sounded too loud in the tiny room. "That was the wind, just the wind, playing with the chimney." She waited. The wind rattled the shutters, hissed along the roof, and whistled through the keyhole. For a long moment, there was nothing else. The teeny-tiny woman released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "See? Just the wind." She picked up her spoon again, though her hand was not quite steady. "Any woman, give me back my one." The voice slid through the room again, a little louder this time, a little more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the kettle, from the corners where the shadows pooled, from the space just above her left shoulder. This time, the teeny-tiny woman could not pretend she hadn't heard it. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She set the spoon down very carefully. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice calm. "If this is some village child playing tricks, it isn't funny." No one answered. The fire cracked softly, a coal collapsing into ash. The kettle hissed. She swallowed. Her mouth felt dry despite the steam in the air. Any woman, give me back my one." The voice was closer now, right at the window, it seemed, or perhaps just beyond the door. The teeny-tiny woman's eyes flicked to the latch. It was down. The door was locked. She had turned the key herself when she came in. The bone, she remembered suddenly, was still in the kettle, steeping. The soup had tasted good, better than anything she'd eaten in weeks, but now the warmth in her belly felt heavy, as if she'd swallowed a stone. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "I am not a child to be frightened by voices and shadows." She stood up, though her legs trembled a little, and crossed the floor to the door. Her cottage was so small that it took only a few steps. She pressed her ear against the wood. Nothing. Just the wind again, heavier now, dragging itself along the walls. She could almost believe she had imagined the voice. Almost. Then, just as she drew away from the door, it came again. Any woman, I'm at your gat. Give me back my bo-o-o-one. The sound sent a cold shiver straight down her spine. She hadn't heard the gate open. She hadn't heard footsteps. But then again, whatever was calling might not need footsteps, or gates, or keys. Her fingers hovered over the latch. Part of her, a stubborn, practical part, wanted to throw open the door and shout into the night, to prove that there was nothing there but fog and falling leaves. Another part, a quieter and older part, whispered that there were some things it was better not to see, even if they were real. "Go away," she said, backing away from the door. "Whoever you are, you're not welcome here." Silence. Then, after a few moments that stretched so long she could hear the tick of her tiny clock, the voice came again, low and echoing, as if it were rising out of the earth itself. Any woman, I'm at your do-o-o-r. Give me back my bo-o-o-one. This time, the latch rattled. The teeny-tiny woman stumbled back until her shoulders hit the far wall. The cottage was too small. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The door shuddered once, twice, as if someone on the other side was testing it, prodding at the lock. Her mind raced. The bone had seemed so harmless, just a scrap, forgotten in the graveyard. But now she pictured the earth closing over the empty place where it had been. She imagined the long, slow years pressing down on whoever or whatever lay beneath that broken stone. She imagined them waking, reaching for a piece of themselves that was suddenly gone. Any woman. The latch clicked. The door swung inward with the slow inevitability of a nightmare. The night outside seemed to pour in like ink, swallowing the candlelight, stretching the shadows tall and thin. In the doorway stood a figure. It was not tall and terrible, as she had half expected. It was about her height, maybe a little taller, wrapped in darkness like a cloak. It had no clear face, only the suggestion of one, features formed from deeper shadow within shadow. Where its eyes should have been, there were two dim, pale glimmers, as if someone had taken the last light of the dying day and trapped it there. The teeny-tiny woman's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but there was nowhere to go. She stood frozen as the figure took one step into the cottage, then another. When it spoke, the voice was exactly the one she had heard, stretched and thin, like a whisper dragged over stone. "Any woman," it said, "you took something that was mine." The teeny-tiny woman forced her mouth to work. It was just a bone," she said. "A small one. I meant no harm. I was hungry." The shadowy shape tilted its head as though considering this. The pale glimmers of its eyes flared for a moment, then dimmed. "You took what was mine," it repeated, more softly now, but with a weight that pressed at the walls. "Give it back." The teeny-tiny woman's gaze darted toward the kettle. The bone was still there, she knew, lying at the bottom, stripped of whatever ghostly flavor it had left to give. Slowly, as if moving through water, she crossed the room. The figure did not move, but she could feel its presence following her like a cold hand at the back of her neck. She lifted the kettle off the hook and poured out the broth into a bowl, letting it splash and steam. The bone rattled against the metal, then slid out into her spoon. It looked different now, duller somehow, and faintly gray instead of white. Her hand shook as she carried it to the figure. "I'm sorry," she whispered, holding out the spoon like an offering. "Take it back, take it and go, and I swear I will never trouble your grave again." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the figure reached out. Its hand, if hand it was not solid. It was a shape more than a substance, a darkness that seemed to drink in the light around it. It closed around the bone without touching the spoon. The bone lifted, floated towards that shadowed form, and disappeared into it like a drop of water into a pool. The cottage seemed to exhale. The walls creaked, settling. The fire gave a louder crack, sending a small spray of sparks up the chimney. The teeny-tiny woman could not move. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain the figure must hear it. Those pale, distant eyes fixed on her. "For the sake of your hunger," the voice murmured, "I forgive you this once." Then, softer, drifting away like smoke. "But remember, teeny-tiny woman, the dead keep what is theirs. Do not take from them again." The figure stepped backward. With each step, it seemed to thin, to fade, until by the time it reached the doorway, it was little more than darkness within darkness. Then it was gone, swallowed by the night outside. The door, still open, swung gently in the wind. The teeny-tiny woman stared at it for a long time. At last, her legs gave out, and she sank into her chair. Her soup sat forgotten on the table, its surface cooling, a skin beginning to form. The room smelled of broth and smoke and cold air drifting in through the open door. After a while, she stood again. Her movements were slow, but they were steady. She went to the door and pushed it shut. This time, when she turned the key, she whispered a small, shaky promise under her breath. "Never again," she said. "I will take nothing from the graveyard, not a stone, not a leaf, not a single crumb of earth." Outside, the wind howled along the road, but the voice did not return. The teeny-tiny woman banked the fire, blew out her candle, and lay down in her narrow bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Every creak of the cottage sounded like footsteps. Every sigh of the wind sounded like a whisper asking for something back. But nothing came. At last, near dawn, she drifted into a restless sleep. In her dreams, she walked through the graveyard again, past stones with unreadable names and crows with watchful eyes. The broken stone where she had taken the bone stood up straight now, and for the first time she saw a name carved there, faint but clear. She woke with the taste of earth and cold in her mouth. From that day on, whenever she passed the churchyard gate, the teeny-tiny woman bowed her head and kept to the path. Her cupboard was never overflowing, but she found ways to manage. Odd jobs in the village, a neighbor's kindness, a patch of garden, she tended carefully through spring and summer. Sometimes, on winter nights, when the wind was sharp and the sky pressed low, she would sit by her fire and think of the shadow in her doorway, of the glimmer in eyes, and the voice that grew closer with every call. And when children dared each other to run through the graveyard after dark, or to take something from it, a stone, a feather, a bit of bone, the teeny-tiny woman would shake her head and tell them, in a very quiet, very serious voice, "Leave the dead what belongs to them. You may think they won't notice. You may tell yourself they don't care. But they do. Oh, yes, they do. And if they come looking for what you've taken—" Then she would lower her voice further until they had to lean close to hear. "You might not be as lucky as I was." And though some laughed and said She was just an old woman with strange stories. No one in that village ever took so much as a pebble from the graveyard again.